The first breakdown happened on a Wednesday morning in the third week of October. Carl Messing had been combining soybeans on his east fields since first light, running his John Deere S780 combine through ground that had dried clean after a week of favorable weather. The harvest window in central Iowa that year was tighter than most. A wet September had compressed the calendar, and every farmer in Jasper County who had soybeans standing was watching the forecast and moving as fast as the ground would allow. Carl was no exception. He had 2,800 acres of corn and soybeans to bring in, and the window the meteorologist was showing him extended another 8 days before the next significant weather system arrived. 8 days was enough if everything ran. If something stopped, it was not enough. The S780 stopped at 9:47 in the morning with a feeder house chain failure that the machine's diagnostic system flagged immediately and that Carl recognized before the system told him anything, because the sound a feeder house chain makes when it lets go is a sound a man who has been combining for 30 years does not misidentify. He shut the machine down. He called the John Deere dealer in Newton. The service manager said he would have a technician out by early afternoon. The technician arrived at 2:15. The repair required a replacement chain that the technician did not have on his service truck. He called the Newton dealership. The chain was in stock. A second trip from Newton to Carl's field and back consumed another hour and 40 minutes. The technician had the chain installed and the machine running again by 5:30. Carl lost 7 hours and 43 minutes of a harvest day that he could not afford to lose. He noted the time in the notebook he kept on the pickup's bench seat during harvest, the same notebook he used every year to track field progress, fuel consumption, and equipment hours. He wrote the time, the failure, the technician's name, and the cost of the service call. He went back to combining until dark. The second breakdown happened 11 days later, during the corn harvest. The machine was his John Deere 8R370, which had been in the field for 4 days running the corn ground without complaint before a hydraulic line failure at the header connection took it down at 2 in the afternoon. Carl called Newton. The service manager said that the dealership's harvest season schedule was fully committed and that he could have a technician on site the following morning. Carl said the following morning was not acceptable, given the forecast. The weather system that had been tracking towards central Iowa for 3 days was now projected to arrive in 36 hours, and losing the afternoon and the following morning to a hydraulic line failure meant losing the window on approximately 400 acres that would not be in position to harvest again for at least a week after the system passed. The service manager said he understood the situation and that he was sorry, but that there was nothing he could do about the schedule. He said every customer in his territory was in the same position and that the dealership's technicians were already running extended hours. Carl said he understood. He asked if there was any equipment in the dealer's loaner inventory that could cover while the 8R was down. The service manager said the loaner program had been suspended the previous year. Carl said he remembered being told that. He had hoped the situation had changed. The service manager said it had not. Carl spent the rest of that afternoon calling every farmer he knew within 20 miles, looking for a tractor that could run the corn head while the 8R was down. He found one, a neighbor's machine that was available for 48 hours before the neighbor needed it back. The neighbor's tractor was not matched to Carl's corn head in the way that his own 8R was, and the field efficiency dropped to approximately 60% of normal as a result of the mismatch. The technician arrived the following morning, repaired the hydraulic line in 2 hours, and had the 8R back in service before noon. Carl had lost the afternoon, the night, and the morning, a window during which the neighbor's tractor had moved approximately 180 acres instead of the 300 the 8R would have handled. When the weather system arrived 30 hours after the repair, Carl had 220 acres of corn still standing that would not be accessible for 11 days. He wrote it all in the notebook. Every hour, every acre, the neighbor's name, the technician's name, the time the repair was completed, the acres he had lost to the weather window. He did not call the Newton dealer to complain. He was too busy to complain, and he was not yet sure that complaining would produce anything useful. The third breakdown came in the second week of November, on the corn that had been left standing after the October weather system. The S780 combine threw a concave crack, a failure that was not repairable in the field, that required the machine to be transported to the Newton dealership, and that the service manager told Carl would take 7 to 10 business days to complete, because the specific concave assembly required was not in regional stock and would need to be shipped from a distribution center. 7 to 10 business days. In November. With standing corn. Carl did not raise his voice on the phone. He was not a man who raised his voice as a strategy, because 40 years of farming had taught him that raising his voice did not change parts availability or repair schedules or weather patterns. He asked the service manager what the options were. The service manager said there were no options that he could identify. Carl said he understood. He asked the service manager to place the parts order immediately and to call him the moment the machine was ready. The service manager said he would. Carl drove to the Newton dealership, arranged the transport of the S780, drove back to his farm, and sat in his kitchen with the harvest notebook open on the table. 3 breakdowns, 1 full harvest season, combined downtime across the 3 events, 41 hours of direct lost field time, acres compromised or lost to weather because of the timing of 2 of the 3 failures, approximately 600. His agronomist's estimate of the yield and quality impact on the weather-affected acres, between $18,000 and $24,000, depending on final moisture and market conditions at delivery. He was not angry in the way that a man is angry when something unfair has happened to him. He was quiet in the way that a man is quiet when something that had been a slow accumulation of evidence finally assembles itself into a clear picture. He closed the notebook and set it on the table. Outside, the November field was flat and gray under an overcast sky, the standing corn rows visible from the kitchen window, 220 acres that would sit until conditions allowed re-entry, losing quality incrementally with every day they remained unharvested. He had done the arithmetic on the quality loss at different moisture intervals. He preferred not to do that arithmetic again. He preferred to think about what he was going to do next, which was a more productive use of attention than calculating the cost of what had already happened. He had been a John Deere customer for 22 years. He had run John Deere equipment because his father had run John Deere equipment, and because the Newton dealership had been, for most of those 22 years, an adequate service partner. Not exceptional, but present, with technicians who knew his operation and a parts inventory that had handled most situations within a reasonable window. What had changed, gradually and then faster, was the gap between what the dealership's capacity was and what his operation required during the specific compressed windows that modern harvest conditions produced. The dealership had not gotten worse, the gap had gotten larger. The result was the same. He called the Massey Ferguson dealer in Grinnell on a Thursday afternoon in November. He had not planned to call. He had not been researching alternatives or building a comparison or preparing a transition. He called because a farmer named Dennis Schultz, who ran 2,200 acres to the north of Carl's operation and who had been a Massey Ferguson customer for 4 years, had mentioned the Grinnell dealer's name twice in the past month in the context of harvest season service response. Dennis had not been campaigning for the brand. He had simply answered Carl's questions about his harvest experience with the kind of directness that farmers use with each other when one of them is asking something real. The Grinnell dealer's name was Frank Hoover. Carl called him and explained, without preamble, that he had just completed the worst harvest season of his farming career from a mechanical standpoint, and that he was not calling to buy anything but to ask a single direct question. Frank Hoover said he was listening. Carl asked what Frank Hoover's service response capacity looked like during peak harvest season. Specifically, what his technician availability and parts inventory position had been during October and November of the current year, when weather compression had put every operation in Jasper County under maximum pressure simultaneously. Frank Hoover said that was a question he could answer specifically rather than generally, and that if Carl wanted specific answers, he was welcome to come to the dealership and look at the actual service records. Carl said he would rather Frank Hoover bring the records to him if that was something Frank Hoover was willing to do. He said he had standing corn that needed attention and that he could not leave the farm easily. There was a pause on the line. Then Frank Hoover said he would be at Carl's farm the following morning. Carl said he had not been asking Frank Hoover to drive out. Frank Hoover said he understood that. He said he was offering to drive out because the question Carl had asked was the right question, and because the only way to answer it correctly was to put the documentation in front of the man who had asked it, and that doing that over the phone was not the same as doing it in person. Carl said he would put coffee on. Frank Hoover arrived at 8:15 the following morning in a pickup that was not new and was not clean and had the specific appearance of a vehicle that is driven hard for working purposes rather than managed for presentation. He carried a expandable file folder that he set on Carl's kitchen table without ceremony. He poured his own coffee from the pot Carl had left on the counter and sat down. The folder contained the Grinnell dealership's harvest season service logs for October and November of the current year. Not a summary, not a prepared presentation with selected data points arranged for favorable impression. The actual logs, technician dispatch records, service call times, parts pull records, customer identifiers replaced with account numbers for privacy, and the resolution time on each call from initial contact to machine back in service. Frank Hoover said Carl was welcome to go through every page. He said he would answer any question about any entry in the log. He said there was nothing in the folder that he was not comfortable Carl seeing, and that if Carl found something that raised a question, he would rather answer it honestly than have Carl leave the table with an unanswered question and draw his own conclusions from it. Carl went through the folder for 50 minutes. Frank Hoover drank his coffee and did not rush him. He did not offer commentary on the entries Carl was reading. He did not volunteer context or explanation unless Carl asked. He understood that a man reading documentation needed to read it without the person who created it standing over his shoulder telling him what it meant. The documentation meant what it said. Carl was capable of reading what it said. What the logs showed was a harvest season service record that Carl read with the specific attention of a man who has just finished a harvest season and knows precisely what the pressure points look like and what adequate response to them looks like. The Grinnell dealership had handled 23 harvest season service calls across its territory in October and November. Average time from initial contact to technician on site, 4 hours and 12 minutes. Longest single response time, 9 hours, on a call that came in at 11 at night during a multi-call day when all 3 of the dealership's harvest technicians were already deployed. Parts availability, 20 of the 23 calls had been resolved with parts from the dealership's service truck or shop stock. 3 had required a parts run from Grinnell, adding between 1 and 3 hours to the resolution time. None had required overnight parts sourcing. Carl set the last page down. He asked Frank Hoover how he staffed for harvest seasons specifically. Frank Hoover said he brought in 2 contract technicians each October through a relationship he had built with a retired equipment mechanic in the county who coordinated a small network of experienced part-time technicians available specifically for harvest season surges. He said the arrangement cost more per hour than his regular staff and was worth every dollar, because the alternative was the situation Carl had just described: adequate capacity for normal conditions and insufficient capacity for the conditions that actually determined whether a farmer's season was recoverable or not. Carl asked about loaner equipment. Frank Hoover said he maintained 3 loaner units, 2-row crop tractors and a utility tractor, available specifically for accounts above 1,500 acres during planting and harvest. He said the loaner program had been the single most asked about feature of his service offering over the previous 3 years, and that the farmers who asked about it were universally the farmers who had previously operated without it, and understood, with direct personal experience, what its absence cost when a machine went down during a compressed window. He said he had never had a customer who used the loaner program once, and then questioned whether the program was worth maintaining. The question answered itself the first time a farmer drove a loaner unit into a field where his own machine was sitting idle. Carl asked what the Massey Ferguson equipment itself looked like on fuel consumption and repair frequency compared to the Deere fleet he was running. Frank Hoover said he would rather Carl ask that question of the farmers who were running the equipment than answer it himself, and that he would provide 3 names and phone numbers of operations comparable to Carl's that had been running Massey Ferguson equipment through the Grinnell dealership for at least 3 years, with their permission to take a reference call. Carl said that was the right answer. He called all 3 farmers over the following 2 days. Each conversation ran between 20 and 40 minutes. Each farmer described their experience with the Massey Ferguson fleet and the Grinnell dealership in the direct, specific terms that farmers use when they are not selling anything and are not trying to influence anything, but are simply answering questions accurately. The picture that emerged across the 3 calls was consistent. Machines that had performed within the range of what the pre-purchase comparison had projected, a dealer whose service response had been tested under pressure and had not failed, and a parts availability record that none of the 3 farmers could point to a significant failure in. Carl called Frank Hoover on a Monday morning and said he wanted to begin a fleet comparison. Frank Hoover said he would have the preliminary numbers to Carl by the end of the week. The numbers came on a Friday. Carl spent the weekend going through them with the same systematic approach he applied to his harvest records, line by line, assumption by assumption, testing the projections against his own operating data on comparable field tasks. The fuel consumption comparison held up against his own records. The trade-in valuations on his Deere equipment were within a range he found credible based on current auction data. The service agreement Frank Hoover proposed was specific about obligations and response time commitments in a way that Carl had not seen from a dealer before. He signed the purchase agreement the following Thursday. 5 machines, a Massey Ferguson 8S265, an MF7S1190, 2 MF6at155 units, and an MF5S125 utility tractor, replacing his full John Deere row crop and utility fleet. The purchase agreement included a service response commitment from Frank Hoover, written into the document at Carl's request, specifying maximum response times during planting and harvest season for service calls and parts situations affecting machines in the agreement. Frank Hoover had not objected to the language. He had read it, suggested one revision to the definition of a harvest emergency that Carl agreed was more precise than the original wording, and signed it. Carl noted in his notebook that the dealer had engaged with the commitment language as a practical document rather than treating it as an obstacle to closing the sale. The combined question he deferred. He was not ready to trade the S780 until the concave repair was complete, and he had run it through one more season to assess its remaining productive life. Frank Hoover said he understood that, and that the offer on the combine would stand for 12 months. Carl called the Newton dealership the morning after he signed. He spoke with the dealer principal directly rather than the service manager. He described the 3 harvest breakdowns, the combined downtime, the yield and quality impact, and the decision the season had produced. He said he had been a customer for 22 years, and that 22 years warranted a direct conversation. The dealer principal listened without interrupting. He asked what the dealership could have done differently. Carl said the loaner program and the harvest season staffing capacity were the 2 things that had determined the outcome of 2 of the 3 failures. He said the 3rd failure, the concave crack, could not have been prevented by better service structure, but that the response to it had been adequate given the situation. He said the loaner program and the staffing were not questions about this harvest season. They were questions about the direction the dealership's service capacity had been moving for several years, and that direction had become clear to him when 3 failures in a single season had landed in the same compressed window. The dealer principal said he appreciated the directness. He said the feedback on the loaner program and staffing was something he had been hearing from other accounts and that he was in the process of addressing it. Carl said he hoped the process moved quickly because the farmers who were making quiet phone calls to other dealers while they waited for the process to complete were not going to wait indefinitely. The dealer principal said he understood. They ended the call without antagonism. The Massey Ferguson machines arrived the first week of March. Frank Hoover's delivery technician walked Carl through each unit, and Carl began his first equipment notebook entries in the format he had used for 22 years. Machine identification, delivery date, initial hours, configuration notes. He had been keeping those notebooks since the year his father had shown him what they were for, which was 1983, and he was not going to stop keeping them because the brand on the hood had changed. What he expected from the coming season was not a perfect season. Equipment fails, dealers get tested, weather arrives ahead of schedule and leaves damage behind it. He had been farming long enough to know that no fleet and no dealer relationship eliminates the risk that a breakdown will cost him something. What he expected was a dealer whose service logs looked like the folder Frank Hoover had set on his kitchen table. Documented, specific, showing response times that reflected preparation rather than improvisation, built by a man who had driven out uninvited on a November morning because the question Carl had asked deserved a real answer, and a real answer required being in the same room. Frank Hoover had driven 42 miles to sit at Carl Messing's kitchen table and open a folder he had not been asked to bring. Carl had never seen a dealer do that before. He intended to find out whether the folder matched the season. The paperwork was already signed. 9 John Deere machines, 2 8R tractors, a 7R, 3 6M utility tractors, a pair of 5M loaders, and a 6.1 45R he'd run for 11 seasons, were listed for trade-in on a dealer agreement covering 4 pages front and back. The Massey Ferguson replacements were already logged at the Regional Distribution Center outside Des Moines. 3 MF8S.265 tractors, 2 MF7S.190 units, a pair of MF6S155 machines, and 2 MF5S125 utility tractors. 9 machines in, 9 machines out. The kind of fleet overhaul that in Hardin County, Iowa, people didn't stop talking about until the next county fair. Raymond Kowalczyk was 71 years old. He had farmed 2,400 acres of corn and soybeans in central Iowa for 43 years, first beside his father, then alone, then with his son Daniel for the last 14. He had run John Deere equipment since 1981. He had the service stickers on the shop door to prove it. He had plaques from 2 different Deere dealers on the wall. He had a coffee cup in the break room of a dealership 40 miles south with his name written on a piece of tape along the bottom, because he'd been in that waiting room often enough that the service manager said he was entitled to a permanent spot. Raymond Kowalczyk ended all of that on a Tuesday afternoon in March with a signature and a handshake. His son Daniel found out by text message. That notification, a confirmation from the Massey Ferguson dealer's finance office, arrived while Daniel was driving a grain truck back from a co-op meeting in Eldora. He pulled over on a county road. He sat in the truck for a long time. Then he called the farm's lender, First Agricultural Credit of Central Iowa, and told them his father had just signed a transaction that would materially alter the collateral position of the farm's existing equipment line of credit. The loan officer asked him to come in. He was there by 4 o'clock. What Daniel said in that meeting, and what the loan officer did in the 48 hours following, would shape the next 18 months of the Kowalczyk farm in ways that neither of them anticipated. But before any of that can be understood, the story has to go back further. Back to the service bay of a John Deere dealership in October of the previous year, where a single repair estimate started the chain of events that led Raymond Kowalczyk to walk away from 4 decades of green iron and never look back. The 8R 340 had gone in for a hydraulic issue. It wasn't catastrophic. Raymond had seen worse, but the estimate came back at $23,400, and the parts lead time was listed at 6 to 8 weeks. 6 to 8 weeks during which the machine would sit in a dealer bay 90 miles from his fields. Raymond asked about expediting parts. The service manager said the supply chain was what it was. Raymond asked about a loaner tractor. Nothing comparable was available. Raymond asked whether the repair could wait until after harvest. The service manager said the hydraulic situation was progressive, and he wouldn't recommend operating the machine in its current condition. Raymond drove home with the estimate on the passenger seat and a feeling in his chest that he recognized. He had felt it once before, in 1997, during the commodity price collapse, when he had sat at the kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and rewritten every number until something worked. That feeling was not panic. It was colder than panic. It was the recognition that the system he had trusted was not going to help him the way it once had, and that a decision was coming that other people would not understand. He started researching that night. Raymond Kowalczyk did not buy tractors the way other men bought trucks. He had owned 11 machines in 43 years. Every one had been selected after months of comparison and calculation. He had spreadsheets going back to 1989, tracking fuel consumption, repair costs, hours, and resale values. He understood depreciation curves the way some men understood baseball statistics. Over the following 3 months, through harvest, early winter, Christmas, and into February, he built a comparison covering operating costs, parts availability timelines, dealer service response records, resale value trajectories, and total cost of ownership across a 10-year horizon. He made calls to farmers in Nebraska, Kansas, and Minnesota. He drove to a Massey Ferguson dealer in Ames and spent an afternoon in the cab of an F8 S265, asking the kind of questions dealers rarely hear from first-time evaluators. The salesman later told his manager that Raymond Kowalczyk had been the most thoroughly prepared prospect he had ever dealt with who had never bought a Massey Ferguson in his life. What Raymond found, when the numbers were laid flat, was not a dramatic story of one brand defeating another. It was quieter and more serious than that. The MF8S265 matched the 8R on horsepower and cab quality. But the ACO parts distribution network had built a regional hub structure in the Midwest that put critical components significantly closer to his county than the Deere supply chain had managed in recent years. Operators he contacted directly confirmed shorter wait times and faster service bay turns. The dealer in Ames maintained loaner capacity for major customers, capacity Raymond's longtime Deere dealer had eliminated 2 years earlier as a cost reduction measure. The economics were not overwhelming. They were not the kind of numbers that make a salesman's pitch. They were the kind of numbers that a 71-year-old farmer with 43 years of real data looks at in a quiet room and decides are true. Raymond made his decision in February. He called the Massey Ferguson dealer on a Monday. He signed the trade agreement the following Tuesday. He did not tell Daniel beforehand. This is the part of the story people in Hardin County argued about for months. Not whether the tractors were capable, not whether the economics held, but whether Raymond had the right to make that call without his son. Daniel held a 40% ownership stake in the operation. The equipment line of credit was in both their names. The trade-ins affected collateral that supported loans Daniel had personally signed, and Raymond had acted without a single conversation. Raymond's position, stated plainly to anyone who asked, was that he had run that farm for 29 years before Daniel held any ownership in it, that equipment decisions had always been his to make, and that the numbers completely supported the switch. He had not told Daniel because he knew Daniel would have tried to talk him out of it, and that the conversation would have been about brand loyalty rather than operating costs, and that he was done having that conversation. Daniel's position, stated to the loan officer and later to a farm business consultant from Iowa State University Extension, was that a $1.2 million trade-in transaction altering the collateral profile of an existing credit line was not a personal equipment preference. It was a financial event requiring joint decision-making under the terms of the partnership agreement both men had signed. The loan officer reviewed the documents, then he called Raymond. That call did not go well. Raymond Kowalczyk was not a man who raised his voice. The people who knew him said he could end a conversation more effectively with silence than most men could with anger. He listened to the loan officer's concerns. He asked 3 questions. He said his attorney would review the partnership agreement. Then he hung up walked to the equipment shed, and stood looking at a row of John Deere machines he had already mentally moved on from. The attorney reviewed the agreement over a weekend. The conclusion was uncomfortable for both sides. The partnership documents were ambiguous on whether equipment trade decisions of this scale required joint consent. They addressed major real estate transactions and land lease commitments above certain thresholds. They did not address fleet replacement decisions, because in 27 years of partnership, neither man had imagined they would need that language. The attorney told Raymond the situation was not clean. He told Daniel the same thing. The Massey Ferguson dealer was holding the order. The machines were staged. The trade-in values were locked. But the dealer principal, a careful man named Hargrove, who had been in the business 31 years, had received a call from the lender flagging a potential dispute. Hargrove told the lender the agreement was signed, but delivery had not occurred. Then he called Raymond and explained the situation without drama. He said he would hold the order for 30 days and that he hoped Raymond understood he could not be caught in the middle of a family dispute. Raymond understood. He did not like it. For 2 weeks, the farm existed in a strange suspension. The John Deere machines were still in the equipment shed. The Massey Ferguson fleet sat at a staging yard outside Ames. The loan officer was waiting. Daniel was waiting. Raymond was not waiting. Raymond was building a presentation. He worked on it for 11 days. Fuel consumption records going back 6 years on every trade-in machine. Repair cost totals, year by year, on each unit. Parts wait times he had logged himself in a notebook kept in the shop office. Comparable operating data from 4 other central Iowa farms that had transitioned to ACO equipment in the previous 5 years. Resale value projections based on current auction data from 2 regional sale barns. A 10-year cost of ownership comparison built on conservative assumptions that, if anything, understated the Massey Ferguson advantage, because Raymond did not present numbers that couldn't survive scrutiny. He put it all in a binder. Then he called a meeting. The meeting took place on a Saturday morning in the office attached to the main equipment shed. Present were Raymond, Daniel, the farm's attorney, the loan officer, and the Iowa State Extension farm business consultant. Raymond set the binder on the table and said he was going to walk through it and answer questions at the end. He spoke for 40 minutes. What he presented was not emotional. It was not about pride or brand loyalty. It was about machinery economics, and every number in it was sourced and documented. The repair cost differential on the 8R alone, projected forward 5 years at the average escalation rate he had experienced, came to $74,000. The parts availability advantage, translated into potential harvest day downtime, represented a conservative 60 to 80 hours of operational risk per season that the Massey Ferguson dealer network substantially reduced. Fuel consumption data on the MF8S Byte 265, drawn directly from operators he had contacted, showed a consistent 4 to 7% advantage over comparable Deere 8R hours in similar field conditions. The loan officer asked about resale values. Raymond turned to the relevant page. The MF8S series had held resale values in regional auction markets within 3 to 5% of comparable Deere units. The gap that Deere dealers always cited first when defending green iron had narrowed significantly as Massey Ferguson's Midwest market presence expanded and buyer confidence in the brand grew. Daniel said nothing for a long time. The consultant asked 2 follow-up questions on the parts availability data. The loan officer asked whether Raymond had a written service commitment from the dealer. Raymond produced a letter from Hargrove's dealership laying out priority service terms, loaner availability for machines above 150 horsepower, and guaranteed parts response times with penalty provisions if the dealer failed to meet them. Nobody in the room had seen a dealer put service commitments in writing before. The loan officer studied the letter. Then he said the bank was satisfied the collateral position was not materially compromised. The trade-in valuations were consistent with current market data. The bank was not going to block the transaction. Daniel left the meeting without saying much. The first 3 Massey Ferguson machines arrived 10 days later. The remaining 6 came over the following 2 weeks. On the morning the last one, an MF5S 125, came off the trailer, Raymond walked out with a cup of coffee and stood in the yard watching. He didn't say anything. The decision was done. What followed over planting season was not a Hollywood story. The MF 8.265 tractors ran tillage passes without incident. Fuel consumption tracked within the projected range. When a hydraulic fitting failed on one of the MF 7S190 units mid-planting, Hargrove had the part on site by 8 the next morning and a technician there by 9. The machine was back in the field before noon. Raymond wrote the time in his notebook. He wrote a lot of things down that year. But the season had a hard moment, and this is where the story turns in a direction that neither Raymond's defenders nor his critics had anticipated. In late May, during a critical planting window that opened after 2 straight weeks of wet weather, one of the MF8S265 units developed a fault code the diagnostics identified as an SCR emissions system issue. The machine derated, reduced power output automatically as a protective measure, at the exact moment Raymond needed every horsepower available. Hargrove sent a technician within 3 hours, but the diagnostic process consumed the rest of that day and into the following morning, 22 hours. During a window Raymond had calculated he could not afford to lose more than 8. He finished the field with the remaining 2 8S tractors running extended hours. The crop went in, but the yield monitor at harvest returned a partial verdict. A strip of late-planted corn showed a drag of approximately 12 bushels per acre on the affected acreage. Not a catastrophic number, but a real one. Raymond called Hargrove without drama. Hargrove's technician had identified a sensor failure in the exhaust after-treatment system. Not a design defect, but a component failure that could occur on any modern high-horsepower tractor regardless of manufacturer. Raymond knew that. He had seen similar emission system failures on late-model Deere equipment. He also knew that 22 hours exceeded what the service commitment letter specified for machines of that class. He said so directly to Hargrove. Hargrove offered a credit on the next repair invoice. Raymond said that wasn't the point. The commitment was the point. Hargrove said the delay had been caused by a specific sensor, his distribution hub had been slow to stock, and that he was addressing it. Raymond accepted that. He wrote the cause and Hargrove's response in the notebook. Then he moved on. Daniel had watched all of it. He had worked through planting without complaint, running equipment alongside the hired men with the careful, productive distance that had existed between the two of them since March. Not estrangement, not open conflict, just the cold professionalism of 2 men who share ground and a dispute and are too similar to bend first. At harvest, something shifted. Daniel climbed into the cab of one of the MF8S units to run a grain cart tractor position. He ran it for 2 days before he said anything. What he said, in the way men who have been in a long dispute sometimes navigate back toward each other without formally acknowledging the argument, was that the cab visibility was better than he'd expected. Raymond was standing beside the machine when he said it. He didn't make anything of it. He said the transmission response was what had impressed him most. Daniel nodded. They talked briefly about the hydraulic mapping on the planter hookup. Then they went back to work. It was not a reconciliation, no handshake, no apology. These were not men who operated that way, but something had moved. A door shut since March had opened a few inches. The harvest numbers came in clean across the operation. Net of the May planting delay, the fuel consumption advantage Raymond had projected held within his forecast range. Repair costs for the full season were the lowest the operation had recorded in 7 years. Raymond assembled those figures into a year-end summary and left it on Daniel's desk without comment. It was a more persuasive argument than anything spoken at the March meeting. Daniel read it. He didn't bring it up directly, but 2 weeks later, when Raymond mentioned that Hargrove was offering a favorable trade-in structure on an MF Momentum planner for the coming season, Daniel said they should go look at it. That was enough. The farm's longtime John Deere dealer had heard about the fleet switch through the normal channels of rural commerce within 48 hours of the signing and had not forgotten it. In early winter, he called Raymond. Not to pitch anything. He said he wanted to understand what had happened. Raymond told him the October estimate, the 6 to 8 week parts timeline, the absent loaner capacity, and the written service commitment Hargrove had provided. The dealer listened. He said some of those service gaps were real and that he had been working to address them. Raymond said he appreciated the call. They did not argue, but Raymond did not suggest he was coming back. The plaques are still on the shop office wall. Raymond has not taken them down. They represent real service from real machines across 40 years, and he is not a man who erases history. What sits beside them now is the service commitment letter from Hargrove's dealership, framed under glass. Raymond put it there himself, not as a trophy, as a document, a reminder that the decision had been made on paper, with numbers, and that the numbers had held. Daniel walks past it every morning when he comes into the shop office to start the day. He has never said anything about it. He doesn't need to. In Hardin County, the story of the Kowalczyk fleet switch is still told the way agricultural communities tell stories that carry more than one truth. Some men say Raymond was right about the economics and wrong about the process. Some say Daniel was right about the partnership agreement and wrong about the machines. Some say the whole situation proved that a farmer who has worked the same ground for 43 years with a data set that thorough has earned the right to make the call without explaining himself to a lender, a consultant, or a son who wasn't farming yet when Raymond was already on his second tractor. What the machines themselves proved over one full season of row crop production across 2,400 acres was less dramatic than the story surrounding them. They proved that a Massey Ferguson 8S265 can run a corn operation as well as the machine it replaced. That parts availability is not a theoretical advantage. It is an operational reality that shows up in a notebook at the end of a long day. That dealer service commitments in writing are worth more than a handshake and a coffee cup with your name on a piece of tape. That a 22-hour emissions system repair during a planting window is a real cost and a recoverable one. That SCR sensor failures are not a Massey Ferguson problem. They are a modern diesel problem shared by every manufacturer subject to the same federal standards. And they proved, in the quiet way that farm equipment always proves things, not in press releases or showrooms, but in fields and fuel logs and repair invoices and harvest data, that a 71-year-old farmer who spent 3 months building a 40-page comparison before signing anything was not acting on pride or stubbornness. He was following the numbers. He had always been that kind of man. In 1997, when the markets collapsed, he had rewritten every number on a yellow legal pad until something worked. The numbers had led him somewhere uncomfortable this time, away from 40 years of green iron and a coffee cup with his name on tape, and he had followed them anyway. At the end of the first full season, he ran the complete operating cost comparison against his 6-year average on the Deere fleet. The advantage to the Massey Ferguson equipment, net of the May planting delay, was $31,400. Not a dramatic number, not a headline, but a real number on a real farm documented in a real notebook for a single season. Over 10 years, if the structural advantages hold, and Raymond believes they will, based on the parts network relationship and the written dealer commitment, that figure compounds into something that matters significantly to an operation running on the margins that central Iowa row crop farms have always run on. Raymond is not farming for 10 more years. He knows that. The farm will pass to Daniel, and eventually to Daniel's children, who are young enough that they think of tractors primarily as large red machines, interesting to climb on. What Raymond built with this decision is not a personal victory. It is a cost structure, a dealer relationship with terms in writing, a set of machines his son now operates and has stopped resenting. That is what a man leaves behind when he makes a fleet decision with a 40-page binder and the patience to let the numbers make the argument for him. Not drama, not a legend. A better cost structure, a written commitment, and 9 Massey Ferguson machines in a shed that will be farming that ground long after the argument surrounding them has been entirely forgotten.